Hello, welcome back. How you guys doing? How you doing? We are jumping back into another exciting installment of Why We Fight. Today we're doing Why We Fight the Battle of China. And in this one, we have, in the Battle of China, we're going to cover a few things. First off, we're looking at the map pre 1931, early 1931 of China. So it's broken down. You can see a bunch of different groups in there. You have the nationalist Chinese government, which is the Republic of China. It was Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of that group. You also had the Chinese Communists, which Mao Zedong was the leader of. You had some different warlord cliques. You had the Mao clique, which was northwest China, which was the Muslim warlords. You had the Zhang Qi clique, which was the central north. They were pretty powerful region control. The Zhangzi, far west, semi-independent. The Yunnan, which was the southwest area. The Guizhang clique, which is the southern China group. They kind of switched sides on who they worked with. They kind of fought against each other and fought and did different things. Then you have Manchukuo, which is right up there in the northeast part. It was actually Manchuria, previously the Empire of Manchuria. It was a puppet state created by Japan. Then you have the Ming Zhang, which is the Inner Mongolian kind of puppet state. Japanese backed the government there. The East Habibi, or East Habia, autonomous government, which is a smaller Japanese puppet government near Beijing. And then you had some breakaway entities there. You had Tibet. You're looking at the Zhangjing, the Tunganistan, which was in Turkestan kind of region. And then you had some other Soviet groups like the Mongolian People's Republic, the Tanwu Tuva, and different groups like that in there. And so that's where they kind of were pre 1931. Here you kind of see a breakdown of some of those different groups. And then Japan, of course, being over there off to the east. So right here, we are looking at what started the war between China and Japan. It's really not as big as what people think. It's the Mukden incident. And what it is this little area that's circled is where the explosion happened. The explosion was so weak. A few minutes after that, a train actually went over absolutely fine. Nothing happened. There was no major damage. But that's what caused Japanese to say, oh, this was done by the Chinese people. This railroad ran all the way through Manchuria, and they kind of staged along in the Korean Peninsula and invaded in. But again, a train went over this 2-3 minutes after the explosion and didn't derail. It was a false flag event. Here we can see it from the other side. Again, no major damage. There were a couple boards broken. That's about it. This is from a political cartoon and a comic book at the time. Then came the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So we're looking at September 1931 in that time period. Here's Manchuria. This green area is Manchukuo that they eventually took over and made its own separate puppet government of Japan. And this was kind of the precipice for the invasion into the rest of mainland China. And here we can see in the star, condemned by the League, applause and hiss, crushing vote on Manchuria, challenges power, not coming back. The Japanese stormed out of the League of Nations. They weren't coming back. But again, they voted to condemn the action. Hey, hello, how's it going, Recon? But did absolutely nothing about it. So we talked about earlier this week, could World War II been avoided? This was the first step on that runway. 1931 in September, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Here we go, the 1937 Nanjing massacre, when the Japanese army brutally murdered thousands of Chinese people. Men, women, children Yeah, and the Japanese made the previous emperor of China the emperor. Yes, he did. He did take one of the members of the royal family and make them the puppet emperor. They had actually taken him and for years had been supplying him with opium, with alcohol, with women, kind of keeping him as like a gilded in a gilded cage there, and then brought him back to run it. And then this is the reason we didn't get involved. There was this huge group, keep the U.S. out of the war. There were several people arguing that we should have gone in and invaded Japan, or at least sent our Navy to confront Japan. We had gone through and cut them down in trade deals and put a blockade on them, but a very weak blockade. They were able to get around it fairly easily. The U.S. government didn't put too much pressure on the Japanese government at all. And the whole thought on this was, well, we don't want to go back to war. And so, again, if we look at this map, if we jump back here, of what we're looking at, this also was made worse by a bunch of outside governments, the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, all kind of putting influence on Japan and backing different horses, and it created a bunch of different governments. So China was not a unified government at this time. And Japan saw it as an easy attack, and that's the reason in 1931 they wanted to come in. So they lined their forces along the Korean Peninsula. If you look over in the south, or in the northeast corner there, you see the Korean Peninsula coming down towards Japan. They lined their forces there, and then after the explosion, they just rushed across the border and took out the fractured Chinese government. There was no hope for the Chinese government to withstand it. We're going to jump into our warning because we're going to show again. There's going to be some graphic stuff in this. The following program contains authentic, unedited footage from the World War II era. The material may include racial stereotypes, offensive depictions, and symbols of hate, including Nazi imagery, as well as wartime propaganda, which reflect the attitudes and realities of the time. These films are presented as originally produced without alteration or censorship for the purpose of historical record, education, and discussion. Mission 4938 does not endorse the views, language, or depictions shown. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. We are going to see some racial stereotypes in this. We are going to see some footage of attacks and footage of war. This was the precipice of World War II. This was the first set of attack. Before Italy went into Ethiopia, before Hitler did anything, and these were what the Nazis looked at of, will the world step up and stop us? And when we didn't stop this, when we didn't stop the invasion of Ethiopia, that's what created the breeding ground, kind of the petri dish example. So that way Hitler could say, okay, this is going to work. We're going to go into it. So we're going to jump into, this is episode 6 of Why We Fight. The only one after this is The War Comes to the U.S. And that one was filmed after. This is one that was filmed in the very early stages of the war. So we will jump into Why We Fight, the Battle of China. Again, viewer discretion is advised. And thank you for the National Archive. They're the ones that have this footage that are presenting to us. And again, another Signal Corps film, like we've been looking at a lot through what our watch-alongs have been. The Army, Air Force, Orchestra, all the great things that come with the Signal Corps.
This, the great city of Shanghai, on a September day in 1937. This, the fearful beginning of a new kind of war. this the first mass bombing from the air of a helpless civilian population. Why? Why are these innocent Chinese men, women, children to die beneath the hail of Japanese bombs? To find the answer to this question, we must first understand something about China and Japan. And to understand China, three facts must never be forgotten. China is history. China is land. China is people. Chinese history goes back for more than 4,000 years. That's a long time. It was only 168 years ago that Washington crossed the Delaware. Only 452 years have passed since Columbus discovered America. It's 1,500 years since the world saw the fall of the ancient Roman Empire. 3,400 years have gone by since Moses received the Ten Commandments. 3,700 years have passed since the pyramids were built. But more than 4,000 years ago, the Chinese Empire was already in existence. And more important, so was a Chinese civilization, a civilization of art and learning and peace. Yes, China is history. And China is also land, more land than the entire continent of Europe, a third larger than the United States, and rich in raw materials. This vast area consists of China proper and 4 outer provinces. To the north is Manchuria, huge and desolate, but abounding in raw materials. Next to Manchuria are Mongolia and Xinjiang. Here lies the Gobi Desert, a vast plateau twice the size of Texas, inhabited by nomad tribes who lead their camel caravans back and forth over ancient trade routes. To the west is Tibet, the icy roof of the world, its borders encompassing the eastern end of the Himalayan mountains, the mystery land that few have entered. And from these vast mountains of the west rise the 3 great rivers. The northernmost of these is the Huanghe, the Yellow River. Far to the south flows the Sikiang, the Pearl River, which enters the sea past the great ports of Canton and Hong Kong. But the greatest river of all is the one that flows between, the Yangtze, winding for 3,000 miles through the heart of China, bringing fertility to the good earth, and bearing upon its broad waters half the commerce of China. Yes, China is land, next to Russia, the largest country in the world. But most important, China is people, 450 million of them.
So we're going to pause again real quick. Again, pointing out it's showing China as being a united government at that time, but it really wasn't. So there was a multitude. It was in a civil war with multitude factions. You had the communists were already rising up. You had the nationalists. You had little warlords. You had some Muslim groups pushing in. You had some of the territories wanted to be independent, and you had the USSR backing some different other communist groups in the north. So this wasn't just one unified country. This was, for all intents and purposes, a multitude of countries kind of broken up, fighting amongst each other before anything comes in. So don't get confused with them kind of talking about China as one country at this point, because at this point it really was kind of a amalgamation of several countries all kind of smashed together.
If the whole population of China were to walk past you, 4 abreast, there would never be an end to the procession, for new Chinese would be born and would grow up before the last man could pass by. Of every 5 persons on the face of the earth, 1 is a Chinese. And since 1/5 of all the human beings in the world are Chinese, we should know what sort of people they are. Well, in all their 4,000 years of continuous history, they have never waged a war of conquest. They're that sort of people.
Okay, so again, they're trying to paint them. This again is straight propaganda at that point. They've never waged a war of conquest. That's not true. But they're trying to paint them as the side that's really kind of being pressed upon and put upon, because they're going to be painting the Japanese in a different way. China had invaded several other nations and had taken over land. They had gone into Korea. They had gone into Russia. They had tried to go into Japan. They'd gone into Southeast Asia. But they are again painting the Chinese people to an American audience who already had some pretty big prejudice. If you go back all the way to the building of the railroads in the 1800s, things like that, there was a dim look on the Chinese. And so this is being presented in a way to get people to feel a lot more sympathy than they would have without painting them in a different light. Not saying that they didn't deserve empathy, but the American sentiment to the Chinese was pretty low at this point.
They developed the art of printing from movable type. They invented the mariner's compass, without which no ocean could be crossed. They were among the first astronomers, and their observations of the stars and planets made possible the accurate measuring and recording of time. They are that sort of people. And why do we call our dishes China? Because the Chinese invented the art of making porcelain. And as we all know, they invented gunpowder, not as a weapon of war, but to celebrate their holidays and religious festivals. And it was one of China's great philosophers who, 500 years before the birth of Christ, gave mankind these words: "What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others." They are that sort of people, enriching the world in which we live. Yes, China is incredibly old, incredibly big, incredibly populous. Yet it was until recently a land with which few of us concerned ourselves. But now a great change has taken place. China is now our fighting ally, or more accurately, we are.
So yeah, gunpowder had been invented with military applications. Again, this is really heavy propaganda-wise towards the Chinese. And again, like they said, very few Americans concerned themselves to what happened with China. And that was one of the reasons we didn't go in to help them in 1931, is because America was like, what interest does this have for America if the Japanese attack and invade into China and into Manchuria? So again, this is 1933, I believe this is filmed. So this is being shown to service members as they join into the military. It's not being shown to the general public yet. And the whole idea is we're going to be getting these people ready to go into the Pacific Theater. They need to care about liberating the Chinese. They need to care about liberating the Philippines and the Koreans and as many people as they can. But this is kind of how they build that empathy. They want to try to paint the Japanese as the Chinese as a very peaceful people and the Japanese as very warlike people.
China. But China has been fighting our enemy, Japan, for 7 long years. Why is this? Why have the Chinese, who in all their 4,000 years of history had never waged an aggressive war, been forced to fight and die by the millions? Because China is land, 4 million square miles of it. And because China is people, 450 million of them. And because Japan had a plan to use them both. That plan was finally stated in the Tanaka Memorial, a blueprint for world conquest, formulated in 1927 by Baron Gishi Tanaka, the Japanese foreign minister.
In order to conquer the world, we must first conquer China.
Here was their mad dream. Phase 1, the conquest of Manchuria for raw materials. Phase 2, the absorption of China for manpower, piece by piece, so as not to arouse the rest of the world. Phase 3, a triumphant sweep to the south to seize the riches of the Indies. Phase 4, the eastward move to crush the United States. One fact was obvious. China was to be the giant back on which Japan would ride to world conquest, just as Russia was to be enslaved for German use. But how was it possible for Japan, only 1/20th the size of China, and with only 1/6 its population, to think of conquering China, much less the world? There were two main reasons for this. In the first place, modern China, in spite of its age-old history, was like the broken pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each piece controlled by a different ruler, each with his own private army. In modern terms, China was a country, but not yet a nation, while Japan was a united, well-knit, highly regimented military dictatorship.
So we're going to pause there real quick. So just before this, Japan had defeated Imperial Russia in their war, and that's what gave them a big foothold in Korea. China, again, was fragmented, but some of the other things that we're looking at here and what's causing Japan to be so successful is they had gathered modern technology and modern machinery and modern guns, where China really didn't have that. Again, China's fighting a multifaceted war because they're fighting all the different factions within inside of itself. But also, Japan was really in desperate need for oil, coal, rubber, any basic natural resources, because Japan didn't have very many of them. And so Manchuria was a logical point to go into because it had huge coal mines, it had deposits of oil, it had deposits of other things, but they were looking at going into Southeast Asia, places like that, for the rubber and for other things they could get from it. So that's why this was so important for them. They had to make ground fall into China. They had to start getting those resources because they knew in a long, protracted war, they would run out of resources before anyone else. Iron was something that they had very little of. They had to import. So all of that stuff, they were going to have to get from somewhere. So Manchuria became a huge, huge point for them to get.
Second reason lies in the uses each country made of our Western civilization. Let's see what China took. You will notice that this is a very old piece of film. Actually, it is more than 30 years old, and it shows a very great man by the name of Sun Yat-sen. In 1911, this man fathered a people's revolution, which brought to an end China's ancient imperial government and began its new era as a modern republic, winning for himself in Chinese history as secure a place as George Washington has in ours. And he and his followers chose for the cornerstone of their new republic Chinese words that echoed those of another believer in democracy.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people.
And to make these principles become reality, they built more schools and colleges. They established scholarships so that their young men and women could go forth to the universities of America and Europe and bring back to their own country other Western ideas. And this new generation returned to China with new techniques of industry, architecture, science, medicine. They built more hospitals to free their people from the blight of disease. They introduced compulsory education. They laid down as essential two of the four freedoms for which we fight today: freedom of expression and freedom of religion. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen died, but his disciples, led by Chiang Kai-shek, carried on his monumental work. Their aim, the unification and modernization of China.
So that was the big thing. You're right on that. The problem with having an older civilization is sometimes you don't adapt to new things. And that's what China was seeing. And Chiang Kai-shek was really pushing that, was to modernize not only the military, but modernize their entire government. And that's part of what pushed some of the warlords away from being a unified government. The other thing was they felt like Chiang Kai-shek was really being influenced by outside nations and westernizing. And so the government fracture came across those lines. They looked at it as, oh, well, if we're going to go through and be tied closer to Western powers, we don't want that. We want to stay China. And so that started breaking some of these other factions off and what caused some of these civil wars. And what their whole goal was is to modernize so they wouldn't be as susceptible to outside influence by other nations. And unfortunately, that kind of was the downfall of the government.
Chinese industry was old-fashioned and inefficient. Transportation was slow and inadequate. But now railroads began to link the great seaports and river harbors with the inland cities. A network of highways began to stretch beyond the railroad lines into the deep interior. After leaving them untouched for centuries, China was beginning to use her vast store of raw materials. And soon the tools and machines of the new factories were delivering the goods and products for China's new economy. For the Chinese believed in using the best of Western civilization for the progress of their country. And while they were building this new nation, just a day and a half by steamer across the Yellow Sea lay Japan. Here the God Emperor and his fanatic warlords were using this same Western civilization for one purpose and only one: to create one of the world's most powerful war machines. Their aim, the absorption of China and the fulfillment of the Tanaka Memorial. For years, Japan had deliberately copied military weapons and industrial techniques discovered in other countries. For years, Japan, under the pretext of lacking raw materials for industry, had been buying in every corner of the world materials not only to build this war machine, but materials which could be stored to feed it in the war of conquest they were planning.
And that's kind of what we were talking about, was Japan was importing as many materials as they could into their country to build up their arms, build up their military, build up their navy. And it should have been a signal to Britain, which Britain had a navy fairly close to Japan at this time. It should have been a signal to them, because that's kind of why they helped take out Russia, or Imperial Russia, during World War I, but right before World War I, is because they thought Russia had eyes on India. They didn't realize that Japan had eyes on India at this time, and had Japan moved towards India, it could have really damaged Britain. And in fact, they did move towards India, and it ended up causing millions of people to starve. And so had Britain realized that earlier, they could have helped intervene, and that would have cut off Japan from really being able to execute their war in China.
For years, while other nations were trying to outlaw war by reducing armaments, Japan was feverishly and secretly building a modern army, a modern navy, a modern air force, to strike its infamous blow at the civilized world. And we all now know about the islands in the Pacific that Japan fortified in violation of all international treaties. These were the reasons why it was possible for Japan, only 1/20th the size of China, and only 1/6 the population of China, to think of conquering China as the first step to world conquest. And as you have seen, in 1931 they embarked on phase one, the occupation of Manchuria. The small bonfire that the Japanese lit in Manchuria was to grow and spread with uncontrollable fury until the entire world was aflame.
And again, this is what we're talking about. Germany kind of looked at what Italy was able to do in Ethiopia, what Japan was able to do in China. And the other thing they looked at was, again, aircraft aren't brand new. They were used in World War I, but they hadn't been used as effectively as they had been used early on in World War II. And before World War II, when Japan was invading China, seeing those air bombings, hitting the large-scale targets, not just hitting military targets, but hitting cities and towns, and just absolutely bombing the people to oblivion, is something that Japan used over and over and over again. And then Germany went through and said, hey, this is a very successful tactic. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing. let's do that to countries to demoralize them and beat them. And that's where this started coming in. So you're looking again, this early part, this 1931, 32, 33 is kind of a petri dish for what was eventually going to happen in Europe.
Phase 1 of the Tanaka Plan was completed, and exactly as planned. The Japs had been confident that this first and sudden land grab could be accomplished without their becoming involved in a major war. And they were right. The unification of China was still too remote for the Chinese of the South to care what happened to their kinsmen in the North. Using the step-by-step technique, a few months later, the Japs took a crack at Shanghai. Chinese resistance was so great they hastily called that deal off, waited another year, and then struck in the north again, carving the province of Yehol out of China proper. This too they got away with. The world criticized, the Chinese protested, but still the Japs got what they wanted, another piece of China, and without a war on their hands. And to rule over Manchuria and Yehol, the Japs then set up a puppet government under their stooge, Henry Puyi, the Chinese quisling prince. But the leaders of New China remembered that in other centuries, other barbarians had invaded their country. The evidence still stood in the Great Wall, built by their ancestors more than 2,000 years earlier, and stretching for 1,400 miles across mountain and desert to protect themselves from the barbarians of the north. Of the Great Wall, it has been said that it is the only work of man which would be visible from the moon. But the Chinese knew that modern
Okay, now we're going to talk about how incompetent the Chinese government was in war. I mean, the national, that is true. However, they were being kind of hit from all over. So one of the big problems they also had, like Chiang Kai-shek, he would go after and attacking the Japanese, and as soon as his back was turned towards one of the other fractured government entities in there, they would turn and attack him. It was literally a catch as catch can when it came to who was attacking who. So you would have the communist led by Mao with Chiang Kai-shek working together to attack the Japanese. And if Chiang Kai-shek pushed in further than the Maoists did, the Maoists would come behind him and start attacking them. And so it was literally a little bit back and forth. But also, who's also heard that rumor that you could see the Great Wall of China from space or from the moon or whatever? This is the kind of stuff that started putting this out. This was an educational film. A lot of people from the military, especially the Army, saw these films before they went to war in World War II. So they were repeating, okay, the government told us you can see the Great Wall of China from the moon, so you must obviously be able to see it from the moon. And that rumor has persisted for years and years now, where people think you can see the Great Wall of China from space. And it just isn't true. But it absolutely was a thing. The government was, the infighting was so severe and so absolutely chaotic in China. But you have to give them credit. They had fought on in this war. So by the time we came into the war, they had already been fighting for 10 years. And so they were putting up as much fight as they could against the Japanese government as they pushed in.
barbarians can't be stopped by a wall, however strong or high. They can't even be stopped by people, unless the people are united. And by 1937, the unification of China was making such progress the Japs got worried. The one weapon they could not permit China was unity. They would strike again before China could become a nation. This time it'd be a big bite. 5 more northern provinces out of the heart of China. At the United States Embassy in China as military attaché for a number of years was Colonel William Mayer. Let him tell you what happened.
The first thing the Japs did was to prepare their usual fake alibi. This time it wasn't a damaged railway track as it had been in Manchuria in 1931. A Jap soldier had disappeared. Obviously he'd been kidnapped by the insolent Chinese. Once more Japan's honor had been insulted. Once more the insult must be avenged. So On the night of July 7th, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking, the Jap war machine struck. Within the space of a few weeks, the invaders were in control of Tientsin and Beiping. It looked as if the Japs were going to have another walkover.
Now the Japs sat back to digest and organize this new conquest. The peace-loving Japanese didn't want a war if they could get their land grabs without one. But this time they were in for a rude surprise. This time, instead of protesting or negotiating, the Chinese struck back. And not in the north, but at Shanghai, where the Japs least expected.
You've got to love these old films. So occasionally we get those interruptions where the reels don't splice in together really great and kind of just flail around, and then we get it back fixed. So again, these are the original unedited files for these films, and so sometimes we get these nice little quirks in here, which I absolutely love. I think they're hilarious to see come in here, because you don't see that in reels
To
today.
understand the fighting that followed, we must know something about the city of Shanghai itself. Situated near the mouth of the Yangtze River, it is the biggest city in China. As the largest seaport in the Far East, it dominated the commerce and foreign trade of China. And through its great docks and channels passed most of the wealth of the Orient. In Shanghai, truly the East met the West. And within this city of 3.5 million Chinese was another city, the foreign settlement, made up of the French concession and the well-known international settlement. There, the various powers, including Great Britain, the United States, and Japan, had stationed detachments of troops, Japanese, British, French, and our own United States Marines, to assist the police of the Shanghai Municipal Council in the preservation of peace and order, and to protect the boundaries of the international settlement. These detachments were limited in size, but the Japs secretly, and in violation of all treaty agreements, had increased their garrison so that when fighting started on the border of their concession in August of 1937, they thought they were fully prepared for any eventuality. The force of the Chinese counterattack almost drove the Japs into the Wangpu River. Backed up by the heavy guns of their warships, however, the Japs managed to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Jap landings were then made in the vicinity of the Wusong forts and in Luho and Lotien on the Yangtze River north of Shanghai. The Chinese drew back to positions 5 or 10 miles inland, where they could secure some protection from the heavy Jap naval gunfire.
And again, we're going to kind of look at this. So this is one of the reasons that China kind of, after the Mao takeover, pushed a lot of foreign governments out, is they remembered that the foreign governments, especially Japan, had stationed extra troops inside their borders and then surprise attack them from within their own country. They had done that same thing in Manchuria before the invasion there. They had moved in extra patrols because they were supposed to patrol the railroad. They brought in extra guns, extra tanks, everything they could. So that way, as soon as they wanted to start the invasion, they could blast off immediately and start attacking. And so for China, they looked at this as, okay, we can't let foreign entities set up in our own country, because if we allow them to do that, they could increase the number and then decide to attack us and be already deep within our own country. And so that's kind of the lesson they learned. It was maybe should have been a little bit more watch what's coming into these foreign agencies. But That's why they kind of closed off from everybody else for a while, and then Nixon was able to reopen it for us.
At the same time, the invaders succeeded in making a surprise landing some 20 miles to the south of Shanghai, put 2 divisions ashore, and pushed rapidly north to outflank the city. The Chinese position was thus made untenable, and a withdrawal was ordered to the west and to the south, toward Nanking and Hangzhou. But only about half of the Chinese army that had fought at Shanghai was left to withdraw. Meanwhile, enraged at the very idea of anyone resisting the Imperial Japanese might, the Japs took their vengeance upon the civilian population of the city. A city without guns or planes to defend itself, and deliberately slaughtered thousands from the air.
So while we're looking at this, let's throw our look back hats on here. So if you remember, the same thing was kind of happening in the Battle of Russia when we're looking at the German invasion of Russia, where they would get pushed to a city limit and then get the Russians would get pushed back by the Germans. But if you remember, they kind of talked about a little bit what the Russians did differently, and we went kind of in depth on that last time during the Battle of Russia video. The Russians would make a line and then behind it have other lines of defense. And so when one line would get pushed back, they would turn and retreat to the next line. And then when the Germans would hit them, it would hit them again, but there'd be more Russians there. And if they were going to get pushed back again, they would withdraw to the next line and build an even bigger defense. And they kept doing that over and over and over again until the Germans were hitting just an insurmountable force. Whereas the Chinese in this, they would retreat and go out into the countryside and not form back in with another group to make a bigger unit to fight them. What they were doing is they would retreat back and, okay, we're going to make our new stand here. Well, if you brought the same forces that just got defeated 20 miles down the road, and you have less of them this time, you're not going to be able to make as hard of a pushback. And so instead of trying to converge and form these deeper lines of defense, they were just kind of scattering. The one advantage they had in that scattering was there was a very large amount of country and there were some mountains and some other things they could go and hide in. But had they done the same thing the Russians would have, it would have made a little bit better of a defense. And again, you got to remember the Russians' planes were destroyed on the ground. So the Russians also didn't have the Air Force at that time to push back the Germans. It was just, okay, let's put our defenses together, take care of the ground forces. We'll make shots at the airplanes when we can, but the big thing is to stop the ground invasion. And so, again, same basic principles that are happening here. The Japanese, again, were treating this as kind of a petri dish of growing what's going to happen across the entire war, but the Chinese didn't come up with the same defense that the Russians did. But again, the Russians have had years and years and years of practice at that one defense of their nation. So you're looking at when Napoleon invaded, things like that. This is what they had done for years. I think 200-300 years. In fact, that was their kind of line of defense. Whereas China had never experienced this before. So when they'd get hit hard and they knew they were going to be overrun, instead of falling back, making a deeper line of defense, and then standing your ground, they kind of would scatter and splinter into more areas. And that, again, is something that we saw the Germans take great advantage of, just like we're seeing the Japanese take advantage of here, where the Germans would go out into a pincer move and come around them, whereas the Japanese were just hitting them over and over again and causing them to run and scatter into more and more pieces. Because if they were small enough pieces, they were easy enough to defeat.
some, there was refuge inside the international settlement, where Japan was afraid to bomb the property and people of the foreign powers. Just yet.
And there again is the other thing. This is 1937. Japan did not want to bomb the British, the French, or the Americans because we weren't involved in the war yet. And they weren't at war with Germany yet. Had they bombed then, instead of there being the giant buildup where they pushed against the Germans, it could have been the British, the French, and the Americans all against the Japanese, and they knew they weren't going to survive that war. So in 1937, they were not willing to take that risk of dropping bombs on the United States Marines, the French, or the British.
There was not room for all. And for each who found safety inside, there were thousands huddled beyond the gates, standing helpless and undefended against the Jap attacks. There was no escape for these surging and panic-stricken people. They could only scurry through the narrow streets, pushing and packing themselves into the center of the city, to be trapped and buried alive in the collapse of bombed and burning buildings. Thus, the Japanese introduced the world to a new kind of war. A war of deliberate terrorization, of deliberate mass murder, of deliberate frightfulness.
And these are hard images to see, but again, you got to think this is what's being shown to troops before they go in, especially the Pacific Theater. I know a lot of people sit there and look at the firebombing of Tokyo happening about 7 years after this and say that that was too extreme. But by the time we did the firebombing of Tokyo, these films were being released to the general public. So they were seeing, oh, this is what Japan has done to all of its enemies. And so it made it where the empathy was a lot less on the Japanese. And then Pearl Harbor, of course, and that attack, it kind of stuck in a lot of not only military minds, but civilian minds that, oh, Japan, when they came in, brutally killed the citizens of the country, not their military. Japan wasn't aiming at military targets. They were aiming at heavy density population areas that they could do the most damage and just demoralize their opponents. And so when, again, 7 years time, you're looking at the firebombing of Tokyo, the hitting of Kyoto, and then both the atomic bomb drops, there were a lot of people who thought, well, they got what they had coming to them. Not saying that that's a correct opinion to have on this, just saying that's where the American mind was kind of at the time when this was happening. And it was kind of set the stage by films like this from 1943.
When the campaign was over, the Japs occupied the entire peninsula east of Shanghai. Reorganizing rapidly, they then launched a coordinated drive on Nanking. One column pushed along the railroad while another swung further to the south. This column then split and continued its drive, hoping to cut off any possible retreat of the Chinese armies defending Nanking. It was here in the Yangtze that the blood-crazed Japs attacked an American gunboat, the USS Panay. despite its distinctive markings. The ship was bombed and sunk with the loss of American lives. The first American warship to go to the bottom in this war. But officially, at least, this was a mistake, and the Japanese government apologized. Meantime, at Nanking, Chinese armies valiantly defended their city, which was the capital of the Chinese Republic.
So we're going to pause real quick again. Sorry, we're doing a lot of pauses in here right now. But again, the Japanese said it was a mistake. They apologized. They paid some money to the American government and to the people killed on that ship, claiming it was an absolute mistake. But one of the real reasons that's been found later was they didn't want that vessel to see what they were about to do to Nanking. Had the Americans reported that back, they were afraid that would full on draw the Americans into the war, and it would have been better off to apologize and pay the money to sink the American ship than the Americans see what they were about to do in Nanking, report it back in case that would cause America to enter the war early. And Japan was not ready for that at this point. They really needed to get as many supplies and extract as much natural resources out of China as they could to help bolster up their military, because at this point, there were points during this war that they weren't able to get enough oil in that their ships could cruise at full speed for more than 4 days. And so had we gone on the full offensive at that point, they would have been in major trouble. So they're extracting resources. They're doing what they can and then preparing. They knew pretty much at this time, they didn't know for sure they were going to attack the United States. There was kind of a thought of going up into Russia instead. It wasn't always for sure that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor. There were two groups. There was a group that wanted to attack into Russia, which was a fairly politically heavy group in Japan. And there was another group that wanted to attack into Pearl Harbor. And they end up, of course, as we know, going into Pearl Harbor, but it could have easily just them gone into Russia and trying to take out the Kamchatka region, kind of coming up around and taking out some of those natural resources in Siberia, which would have caused the war to be very different. It would have caused the complete collapse of Russia. But it's all a resource thing. They're all just debating what resources they can get and what way is going to be the easiest. And at this point, they still hadn't decided, but they did not want American boats witnessing what's about to happen in Nanking. If this gets too far into kids or anything else getting injured, we will jump ahead a few minutes, but if not, we're going to play through it because this is a very important part of the war and it's something that should be remembered. What happened in China at this point was one of the on the same level of what Germany was doing. It really was an absolutely awful massacre. Japanese power was too great, and after a battle lasting but a few days, the city fell to the invaders. In their occupation of Nanking, the Japs again outdid themselves in barbarism. The helpless populace was trapped by the city walls and could not flee. The Japanese soldiers went berserk. They raped and tortured. They killed and butchered.
In one of the bloodiest massacres of recorded history, they murdered 40,000 men, women, children.
We're going to jump ahead because it's going to get fairly graphic from this point. So we're going to jump up a little bit further into the invasion and get past the Nanking. But the massacre is very important. If you don't know much about it, please look into it. It is one of the more horrific acts of war that has happened. And in fact, that is the reason there were so many wartime tribunals. People hear about Nuremberg a lot, the Germans coming under war tribunals. Japan also had the same ones, but a lot of times we don't pay as much attention to the massacres and just the absolute brutality that happened in China. I know when I was in the military, I went to Hong Kong, I went to Korea, and if you talk to them about it, there are still a lot of people that harbor some deep, deep hate for the Japanese people and for the Japanese government. That's the reason there are still not very close ties between Japanese government and the Chinese government today. It's the reason there's not close ties between the Korean government and the Japanese government today. There is a lot of very, very long-running, deep, deep hate of the Japanese government. And still to this day, the Japanese government doesn't cover any of this in their history. If you go there, you talk about their education and what they are taught in history on this, all of this is just completely and totally covered up.
The strength of China must be moved to the west, beyond the mountains, beyond the railroad lines, beyond the lines of communication. There, safe from enemy attacks, they might produce the rifles and guns that China so tragically needed. Thus, China would trade space for time. Space for time. Blow up the roads. Space for time. Scorch the earth.
And here we're seeing they're starting to get that same idea that Russia had. Let's blow up the roads, blow up bridges, set fire to things that could feed the Japanese as we retreat backwards. Let's make it hard for them to cover distance. Let's make it mandatory that they bring their own food and supplies. Because if you can go through and deny access to food, if you can deny access to easy travel, if you can deny access to anything that would make life a little more comfortable for your attacker, the better. It's that whole trick that Russia used on Napoleon. Burn the fields if you can't harvest them and take it with you. Kill the cattle if you can't get them to come with you. Leave nothing for them to use. Everything usable must be destroyed instead of giving it to your opponent. And so it took a long time. So 1931 to about 1937, this is almost 1938. That's when China said, okay, this isn't the same kind of war that we've seen in the past. We must make a fire burn to make sure that they cannot get to us as easily. And so this is when you start seeing that change in how they're approaching things, change in that dynamic.
Space for time. Blow up the factory building. Leave nothing for the invaders. And then the people rose and moved, riding, walking, crawling. Million of them, spontaneously driven by an epic impulse, rose and made their way westward. The earth...
Just a brief pause. I think I'm at least going to call for a motion on the fact that those little baskets that guy was carrying that had people on each side of the basket and was walking along, I think Recon Sarge should be able to do that for anybody that wants to come out and hang out and visit us at our VFW post. I think he could carry 2 of us at a time, crossed his back in those little basket things. I don't know if anybody else has that feeling or not, but I think we should get that done.
Teeming with them, moving westward on a trek that stretched through 2,000 miles of roadless wilderness. Thus the world witnessed one of the most amazing spectacles in human history, the greatest mass migration ever recorded. Whatever could be of use and could be moved, the Chinese took with them on a Homeric journey. Their libraries, their schools, their hospitals, all dismantled and carted away. The machinery from over 1,000 factories, weighing over 300 million pounds, was moved away in trucks and ox carts and on their backs, 2,000 miles away, 2,000 miles westward. Wherever they could, they gathered along the few remaining railroads, waiting, hoping for some chance to ride part of the way toward their westward goal. And when they had packed the last train with the last ounce of humanity and machinery, the tracks themselves were taken up, rail by rail, tie by tie, to be transported westward, to leave nothing for the enemy.
So again, we're going to draw another parallel. We're seeing the Chinese pack up the railroads, the factories, everything they can take with them, going westward. At the same point, you have the Russians packing up, not quite at the same point, a little later than that, the Russians packing up all of their stuff and going eastward. And so they're pulling away from their enemy, whether it's the Japanese or the Germans, but also at the same time, the Germans still had their Siberian battle regiments up there in Siberia. So these people going westward, they're going to get closer to those groups that the Siberian military was at. And Siberia groups were not moved out from there to the Western Front until Russia realized that Japan wasn't going to attack them. So these people are going towards somewhere that's already going to be safer. If they can get close to the Siberian army of Russia, they know the Japanese aren't going to go straight into them, because those people were trained in the area they're in. They're trained for the cold. They're trained for that fight. It was not a fight the Japanese wanted to have.
Every river pointing westward was heavy laden. Every sampan, every barge was pressed into service, weighted down to the water's edge with the precious tools for new China. Nothing could stop them, not even the rivers that narrowed into mountain gorges. Westward with their loads of machinery, more precious than gold. Progress was measured by the mile, by feet, by inches. The trail they broke was moistened every step of the way by their sweat. Where there were no trains, no boats, no ox carts, there were still willing hands and willing feet and straining backs. 30 million people moving westward. Westward from the invader. Westward from slavery and death. Westward to freedom.
So we can't pull it back up without restarting the video. But as they're heading west, we talked about the government being broken up and being a bunch of different cliques. So they're going to be traveling across some other areas that are not the Republic of China. And where they're heading is right into the Chinese Soviet Republic camp. Mao Zedong, people like that. So they are heading in there. And once they're there, they are going to be in an area that is majorly communist heavy. And these people are looking at the communists as their salvation at that point, because the Maoist army was not going to give up anybody else to fight for the Republic of China because they wanted to hold their own collective. And so we're starting to see the beginnings of that transition tipping point for the nationalist army under Chiang Kai-shek to fall to the Maoist army as these people looked at Mao as their savior.
Now in the free mountain lands of the West, ancient cities sprang into fresh and modern life. Chief of them all was the new capital of free China, Chongqing. Here on the cliffs high above the Yangtze River, the Chinese had re-established their government. They knew, however, that the people of the city would not be safe from Jap air raids. The memories of Shanghai were fresh in their minds. And in the sandstone cliff on which the city is built, thousands of workmen rushed the construction of enormous caves as shelters for the people and for the pitifully few machines, more important than life. To the Japs, Chongqing became the heart of the Chinese.
You're exactly right on that. The Maoists, the communists, stayed in the mountains and hid, and they were doing the hit and run attacks. This is kind of what they're talking about. They're building these caves inside the mountains, and that's where Mao and his people were mainly at, was already up there in those caves. Also, Chiang Kai-shek, when he retreated, he didn't retreat to go up into the mountains and hide. He went backwards, but he was going to go back and attack the Japanese again. Had Chiang Kai-shek and Mao and a bunch of the other groups agreed, hey, look, we can work together. Let's push the Japanese out and then continue our civil war, we'd had a very different China. But that's not how the world works. We know that when somebody thinks that they're going to get an advantage over the other, that's what they're going to try to do, especially when you're trying to become a dictator of a country. And so that's what ended up happening was, hey, Chiang Kai-shek's going to stay down there and fight. I'm going to stay up here. I'm going to ensure, as if I'm Mao, I'm going to stay up in the mountains. I'm going to try to feed the people what I can, kind of indoctrinate them. So when they go back out, I'm going to have a larger army to fight against Chiang Kai-shek in the future.
Chinese nation they were determined to conquer. Destroy Chongqing, and they would break the spirit of new China. As they couldn't reach the city by land, they would send their bombers to blast it from the face of the earth.
And there is what we're talking about. They had the caves built in, so these guys are going to send bombers to drop on them. But if you're down in the caves, the bombs aren't going to hit you other than cave-ins. And if they're not going to send ground forces, you're pretty safe. Whereas Chiang Kai-shek's guys were down there fighting on the ground, where they're going to get to you and the planes are going to get to you. So it's kind of exactly what you're just talking about right there.
Against these Japanese armadas, slow and obsolete Chinese planes made a suicidal attempt to defend Chongqing.
So take a look at that. You have biplanes that are going up against, these are the pre-Zeros and early Zeros. of the Japanese army that are jets. Some of them are. Some of them still are props, but some of them are jets at this point against biplanes. And it was a really unfair fight, but China had not put a whole lot of money in, nor was encouraged to put a whole lot of money into modernizing the Air Force. It's the same thing we saw with Haile Lassie from Ethiopia. He had one plane. It was a biplane. And what was that going to do against modern military? And it wasn't until the Hellfires and some of that from the United States military started coming in that the Japanese Air Force was even slightly in danger. And then once the Hellfires really started coming into this theater, the Zeros were proved that they were kind of behind the power curve. They had also not advanced their planes. So we're going to pause again. Another crazy thing, if you look into the Chinese airplanes at the time, some of them were even pre-interrupter gear, which means you're not able to fire machine guns through the front of your plane. You have to have another person shooting a gun, because if you'd shoot a machine gun without the interrupter gear, it would actually blow your own propellers off. So some of these planes that are in these dogfights for China are still somebody either shooting a rifle, or they may have a machine gun for the back gunner to shoot with, but some of them are a pilot with a pistol and a second gunner with a rifle or a shotgun or whatever weapon that they happen to bring with them. And it was just such an unfair dogfight that it was just ridiculous. But again, it's kind of showing if you change up as war changes, if you don't advance with those changes in war, you're going to be absolutely decimated. You can have as many planes as you want to, but if they're a biplane versus a jet or something that has the ability to actually shoot forward, you may be in a lot of trouble. It doesn't matter if you put up 100 planes or if you put up 20. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, is this just one-sided dogfight. So we'll pause and address that, because two of you are pointing out the same thing. So the Chinese National Army had bolt action rifles. However, not all those were Chinese national soldiers. Any of the warlords that were fighting with Chiang Kai-shek on his side, 90% of them were fighting with World War I rifles, muskets, or some of them had homemade guns still. Something that we haven't seen since the Revolutionary War. There are actually a lot of pictures you can find of some of these warlords going up with the Chinese National Army to fight the Japanese, and you see them bringing long muskets. You have kegs of gunpowder they're bringing, round balls. They are fighting the equivalent of what we had for the Revolutionary War. Some of them would get new rifles. The big change came in Mao's army. If anybody has looked into this as well. Mao's army was very competent of going in and taking rifles off of dead Japanese. And so Mao's army was slowly building up a set of modern rifles because they were not actively attacking the Japanese. They were waning, going through and grave picking and grabbing as many of those guns as they could. But yes, a lot of the warlords, their armies were still fighting with muskets. There's even a few stories of them having some Imperial Russian guns from World War One, which were really, really outdated at the time. You're looking at groups, and then if you get into some of the other groups were still fighting with horses and bow and arrows. So it goes even further back than just having muskets. They were really, really underarmed and didn't feel a major need to modernize their weaponry until way too late. And some of them had no way of modernizing their military equipment because they were in the distant West. They were a warlord. They were only getting what they could get from different marketplaces and from trading and from things like that. So you are 100% right. There are a lot of groups that were still fighting with muskets, and they would come up against modern Japanese military that had machine guns and had really, really great weaponry. And so if you're out there fighting with a musket, the chances of you surviving in a combat like that is just so minimal. But yes, you guys are right. They were using, there was a large group of Chinese military fighting with muskets.
But neither Japanese planes nor Japanese bombs could destroy the life of the city. For not only the people, but the factories had gone underground, where the vital machines could operate by day and by night, safe from bombs and shrapnel.
So again, we'll bring this back into light. These are underground. These are in the West. So Mao's army was operating in this area, so was able to pick up some of these newer guns that were being made and the artillery. And you're right, Historical Possum, on the could be a logistical nightmare. It was. There was not a standard issue round. There wasn't a standard issue caliber. There was just what they had. And so if you look at when I was in the military, I'm sure Recon can probably vouch for it when he was in the military. You have a standard issue round. You know, okay, this gun takes a 5.56, this one takes a 7.62, this one takes a 9mm, but it's not going to be this one takes a 38, that one takes a 5.56, that one takes a 30-06, that one takes a. You're not having every single gun has a different one. You have something with you, something around you that's going to be able to take standard issue rounds, standard issue armaments, and so it makes it easier to resupply. But when you have these groups moving around and they're carrying every single type of round you can imagine, and some that are made at home, because again, that was something that was happening. They were melting down lead and tin and anything they could get to make bullets with it. The standard issue rounds weren't a thing. It made it a real nightmare for logistics supply. And if you're unfamiliar, since Alexander the Great, logistics a lot of times determine the winner. You can have the best equipment, but if you're not able to resupply and you're not able to keep a flow of supplies to your troops, eventually you will falter. And so that's something the U.S. military has learned very well. That's something that in World War II, we were seeing examples of people who were not able to resupply, who maybe could have held ground or could have taken ground, who were not able to do it. And that's kind of the fall of Germany coming into Russia, why they were getting pushed back so hard. Resupplying is so critically important. That's part of the reason Japan is invading China at this point, because they realize we have to have a steady flow of supplies or we will lose the war.
This time, the Chinese had anticipated their enemy. In spite of bombs and fire and destruction, this time the Chinese stood fast. Flaming Chongqing became the symbol of their indestructible spirit. the call to arms sounded throughout New China. And from the vast interior, China's millions answered the call. They came from the south and from the north, from the east and from the west, to form a people's army. With a new faith in their hearts, men and women left their homes and farms to fight for something bigger now than each man's home, and each man's farm, and each man's life. They were fighting for New China. New soldiers, awkward and unskilled, like all new soldiers. But they toughened and trained. They learned the discipline and order of drill. They knew they must strike and strike hard. They learned to kill. The youth of China also came forward, training to care for the sick and the wounded. Girls joined their husbands, brothers, and sweethearts in uniform. And to the aid of China came volunteers from other lands, men who pledged themselves to fight against tyranny and oppression no matter where. Americans like the legendary Colonel Chenault and his Flying Tigers, who, with their few American planes, were knocking down enemy planes at the fantastic ratio of 20 nips to one of their own. The Japs had hoped to ride to world conquest on the back of the giant Chinese workhorse. Phase 2 of the Tanaka Plan called for breaking the horse to their will. But the great patient horse refused to be broken. The enraged Japs saw their whole plan of conquest bogging down. So they set out to drain the giant's strength by cutting the arteries through which flowed China's lifeblood of supplies. They penetrated along the rivers. Railroads destroyed by the Chinese were rebuilt with slave labor as the Japanese moved inland to secure control of key rail lines and important communications. And China's supply lines from the outside world were cut off by Jap warships blockading the coast. The Japanese strategy was the isolation of China. Port after port was occupied. This meant China was being cut off from supplies she couldn't manufacture for herself. Supplies she was getting from her Western friends. Without oil, gas, guns, and planes, China was doomed. With the whole of the Chinese coast in the hands of the Japs, there would only be two routes over which to bring the vitally necessary materials. From Indochina, a narrow-gauge railway ran inland from the sea to Kunming, connecting with a truck road that went to Chongqing. But its capacity was limited. And then there was the old trail of the camel caravans from Russia across the Gobi Desert, which could bring in even less. Not only did these routes provide too little for China's needs, but they were too near Jap territory to be safe. There was only one other possibility. In Burma was a railroad that ran from the port of Rangoon to Lashio. Separating it from the truck road at Kunming were hundreds of miles of high mountains and deep river gorges. If this stretch of...
So let's go ahead and pause there. So we're going to talk real quick about the Flying Tigers. So they mentioned them briefly. The Flying Tigers were actually all in the United States Army Air Corps. Army Air Corps. Let me get the words out correctly. China had hired them to build an air force to fight back. They were flying P-40 Warhawks. They all painted on the iconic shark teeth on the front of them. All of them resigned from the United States Army to do this fighting. And they protected the Burma Road. They flew a lot over Burma, protecting it, protecting parts of China, trying to get the supplies through. They saw it as an imperative that we had to keep China from taking, or keep Japan from taking all of China, because if Japan was allowed to take all of China, they thought it would make Japan unstoppable. The U.S. was not officially in the war yet. These were all volunteers. They were no longer in the United States military. This was its own group. After Pearl Harbor, they were absorbed back into the U.S. military. They were given their previous ranks. Some of them were given higher ranks. They had a very, very high ratio when it came to dogfights. They were amazing. It was a huge, huge morale boost to China. And because they were no longer with the military, they were allowed to develop their own tactics. And their tactics were extremely aggressive. They were moving in and hitting the Japanese in ways that they could not imagine. They had a huge kill rate. They were swooping in and hitting Japanese planes. And because they were a volunteer protective force, there were no rules on their engagement. There was nothing that stopped them from how they were going to fly, how they were ever going to be able to take them back. They were very, very concerned with what was happening with Japan, and that was their way of stopping it, was to be involved this way. Had they not been there, the routes through Burma that we're going to learn about probably would not exist. It would have probably saw the collapse of Japan, but Japan now had an enemy in the air that wasn't flying biplanes and knew how to take them out.
If this stretch of tortuous mountain trails could be replaced by a modern highway, where now only pack trains could pick their plodding way, China would have a practical supply route to Burma and the sea. Several internationally known firms of engineers were called in to do the job. They said the work might be completed in 6 or 7 years, if China could supply them with the most modern machinery. But China didn't have the modern machinery, nor did she have the 6 or 7 years. So she began building the road with her bare hands. By thousands, by tens of thousands, by hundreds of thousands, they toiled at the back-breaking task of carving this desperately needed supply line out of the reluctant mountains. Out of their toil and their sweat, they created the Burma Road. Not in 6 or 7 years, but in less than 12 months. A monument to the new spirit, to the new China. As soon as it was completed, the road went into immediate service. By thousands, the trucks shuttled back and forth between its terminals, climbing to nearly 10,000 feet, around hairpin curves, along the edges of sheer precipices, where passing trucks had barely 1 foot of clearance. And the blood plasma of new supplies flowed steadily over China's lifeline to the sea, protected by Colonel Chennault's incredible flying tigers. But Chinese sacrifice cannot be measured only in miracles of construction. It must be counted, too, in the tragedy of destruction. For while still the Burma Road was being built, the invading Jap armies had fanned out and straddled fully 2/3 of the railroad lines of the country. In the summer of 1938, they set out to capture the remaining 1/3, starting with the vital railroad junction at Chengchao. Chengchao is situated on the banks of the Yellow River, China's sorrow. Originally, the river flowed from Chengchao southeastward to the Yellow Sea. But nearly a century ago, a great flood abruptly changed its course, swinging it far to the north. For generation upon generation, as the spring floods rushed down to the sea, thousands of Chinese worked on the dikes to hold the river in its new course, protecting their homes and their crops. Now, as the Japs advanced on Chengchao, the Chinese blew up the southern dike of the Yellow River, thus loosing a flood between themselves and the Japs. Once more, the river flowed in its old course, forming a barrier which to this day has prevented the Jap from entrenching himself in this area. Thus, once more, with no thought of the human sacrifice or the material cost, the Chinese traded space for time. And the Chinese had still other tricks to pull from their patched and faded sleeves. You will notice that this map of Jap conquests doesn't look like the military maps you have seen in the previous films. By all military standards, it should have looked like this, which is the way the Japs wanted it to look. But the Japanese were learning that the occupation of Chinese cities and control of Chinese rivers and railroads still was far from meaning the subjugation of China. For the Chinese had formed themselves into guerrilla bands, trained to harass the Jap forces. These guerrillas were mostly farmers who had stayed behind on the land when the Great Migration to the West took place. Peaceful.
So we're going to pause there. Can we think of any other idea of where they use the same technique again? This right here was the basis of how they fought in Vietnam. You're going to go through, you're going to hit guerrilla tactics, you're going to leave people as much as they can if they're not being affected, and then those people can turn around and hit your enemy and keep you from maintaining control of a whole area. This, what we're seeing in World War II, how they were so unindustrialized, is what kind of one of the steps that helped make Mao want to do the Great Leap Forward in 53, 52, and around that time period. So, and that's what caused a great amount of famine and starvation. The problem is you go to Korea, they tried to fight like a regular military. And in Korea, they found out, okay, that didn't work great. So they adapted and said, okay, let's have the modern military equipment, but let's still fight a little bit like we did during World War II and deny wholesale control of areas. And so they kind of adapted their forces that way. So still to this day, the Chinese don't fight really like a modern military fights. They still use a lot of the guerrilla tactics. You're going to see them fight kind of like what we saw in Afghanistan, what we see in some countries like that. That's still how the Chinese look at battle. If we can deny full-sale control over an area, we can give up all the area around it, and then we can keep isolated pockets of guerrillas that are equipped and trained that they can keep causing problems behind the enemy line. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, the logistics. If I can keep guerrillas behind your line, I can interrupt your logistics. And if you don't have good logistics, you can't win a war against us. And that's kind of the same idea. This is where we're seeing it. So we're seeing these tactics they learned during World War II, adapted and taught to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And then they kind of gave up those tactics immediately after World War II and said, okay, we're going to fight like the Japanese, we're going to fight like the Americans. And that's what they did in Korea, with two very different outcomes.
Farmers one day, deadly fighters the next. They made an unpredictable and uncontrollable enemy. The Japs held the lines of communications, but in the pockets thus formed, these unconquerable guerrillas constantly sniped at the Jap invaders. When the Japs tried to annihilate them, they disappeared, only to reappear in another pocket. Attacking with speed and surprise, they ambushed enemy patrols. The Japanese were fighting more than the Chinese people. They were fighting the Chinese land, the great distances, the rivers, the floods, the swamps and marshes. These too were enemies that defied the Jap war machine. The giant back Japan intended to ride to world conquest was proving to be a bucking bronco. Phase 2 of the Tanaka Plan had bogged down in what the Japs still referred to as the China Incident. This left them in a fateful quandary. Phase 2 of the Tanaka Plan was still incomplete, but Phase 3 and Phase 4 could no longer be delayed. In Russia, the overwhelming German offensive was taxing Russia's military capacity to the limit, removing any Japanese fear of Russian interference. Britain, after the sledgehammer blows of Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, was left groggy and militarily almost exhausted. Her navy scattered across the seas, guarding her lifeline of supplies. But here in America, we were finally awakening to our danger and taking steps to protect ourselves. We had appropriated funds for the construction of a two-ocean navy, and our army was rapidly expanding. If the ultimate objectives of the Tanaka Plan were to be achieved, now was the moment to strike. Now, when Russia was otherwise occupied. Now, before Britain could recuperate. Now, before we could gather too much strength. So the Japs made a fateful decision. They would embark on Phase 3 and Phase 4, the conquest of the Indies and the United States, without waiting to complete Phase 2, the conquest of China. Thus, to paralyze American power in the Pacific. Without warning, as they have always struck, they struck again. According to all the rules, China's position should now be greatly improved. For in her war with Japan, China now had fighting allies. Ourselves, the British, the Dutch. But it didn't work that way for China. For in those tragic early months of 1942, when we sustained defeat after defeat at the hands of our common enemy, China endured the worst setback of all. Out of our defeats, China lost the Burma Road. But still, China's courage never faltered. Her determination never weakened. And in the history of those long and tragic months of black defeat in 1942, one bright page stands forth. A page written by our Chinese allies. Here is the city of Changsha. The Japs wanted it for two reasons. It was in the center of the Chinese rice bowl, and it was also an important railway junction. Twice before they had tried to take it, and twice before they had been thrown back. Massing a large striking force near Yocho, on Christmas Eve 1941, the Japs started southward toward Changsha in 3 columns. At 3 points during the drive south, the Chinese forces put up token resistance. But instead of withdrawing toward Changsha, they withdrew east into the mountainous flank. By New Year's Eve, the Japs had surrounded the city. They quickly pierced the outer defenses and attacked the inner defenses from 4 directions. In spite of fierce resistance, the Japs were certain that the fall of Changsha was only a matter of hours. What they didn't know was that they had walked into a well-baited trap. For the Chinese forces, which had withdrawn into the hills, now swept down on the Jap supply lines. and cut them to ribbons. The Jap forces attacking the city soon ran out of food and ammunition and began a withdrawal, whereupon the Chinese launched a counteroffensive and pushed the Japanese back where they had come from.
And again, this is something we've talked about over and over in this. It's about logistics. They had allowed the enemy to line up in hiding along their supply lines. And then once the Chinese were able to jump in and pierce through their supply lines and hit them hard and cut them from being able to get food, ammunition, fuel, everything they needed to continue on the assault on the city, it was over. Once your supply line's cut, it's like an umbilical cord for a kid. There's no more food coming. You're going to be on your own. And they did not send enough to be on their own. And so they have to retreat backwards across those same groups that had already cut their supply line, but now had expended even more supplies because they didn't realize their supply line was cut until too late. So they had already used up a lot of their ammunition, a lot of their food, a lot of what they had, and they had a really large distance to make up to pick up those supply lines again.
The Jap column was forced to run the gauntlet of continuous attack by the pursuing Chinese forces. The Battle of Changsha was a magnificent victory for the people of China, the people who wouldn't surrender, the people determined to fight for their freedom, their good earth, the people who can't be beaten. And as 1944 dawns, there is another and greater story being written. From the Aleutians to the South Pacific, we are on the offensive. In the jungles of New Guinea, in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, on the shores of New Britain, on the broad Pacific waters, Japan faces the daily expanding power of the nations she attacked. And in India, American, British, and Chinese forces are gathering strength under Lord Mountbatten for the liberation of China. For China's war is our war, and now her millions belong not only to United China, but also to the United Nations. Leader of our American forces is General Stilwell, who has the unique honor of being the Chief of Staff of all the Chinese Expeditionary Armies. Division after division of picked Chinese troops are being flown in our planes from China to India, where they are armed and equipped with the most modern American weapons. Trained and hardened to spearhead the coming drive against Japan. Through enemy-held territory in northern Burma, the new Lido Road is being pushed. Over mountains, through jungle and swamp, from India to China, to connect with the old Burma Road. In the jungle on either side, American and Chinese patrols protect the road and strike at the Japs. Their supplies and ammunition brought in by plane and parachute. From fields in India, an Air Transport Command plane takes off every 6 minutes, loaded with artillery, jeeps, ammunition, men and supplies for the armies of China. Over this Burma skyway, over this hump of mountains 16,000 feet high, more tonnage is being flown into China than was ever trucked in over the old Burma Road. And in the skies over China, Japan faces new opposition. Young Chinese, many of them trained on the fields of Arizona, New Mexico, California, fly and fight beside their American comrades. The fighters and bombers of the Chinese Air Force and those of General Chennault's 14th Air Force today fly far and wide over China, hitting enemy concentrations, smashing their sea lanes along the China coast. The same people that moved a nation 2,000 miles, that built the Burma Road, are building airfields out of stones, mud, and patient, tireless hands. Today, though still cut off by land and sea from the rest of the world, Chinese armies and Chinese guerrillas still stand firm against the Jap war machine. The oldest and the youngest of the world's great nations, together with the British Commonwealth, fight side by side in the struggle that is as old as China herself, the struggle of freedom against slavery, civilization against barbarism, good against evil. Upon their victory depends the future of mankind.
We in China, like you, want a better world, not for ourselves alone, but for all mankind, and we must have it.
Alrighty, so that was the Battle of China. Our next one is going to be War Comes to America. That was done in 1945 after the war was over. So be ready for that. That'll be on Thursday. But tomorrow, you're not going to want to miss out in the early part of the afternoon. We're going to be having Recon Sarge going live in Fallout 4 again. If you're tired of the same old bro veteran streams that you've seen, you're not going to want to miss this. We have a lot more engaging content. He's going to be jumping in back into the Fallout universe, and then he'll be back on Friday with Fallout again. I'll be back on Thursday at 8:30 with the final of the Why We Fight watch-alongs. And then next week, we'll be jumping into some other great content. But we enjoy you guys being here. We really are glad that you're all here. Give us a like, give us a follow. Check out some of our shorts. We have a lot of great stuff out there for you. And as always, stay strong, stay true, stay Frankie. We'll see you. Oh. Happening, or are they going to bring up Reorganized National Republic China? Okay, happening, which is Japan's puppet state. So that is going to be brought up a little bit in Why We Fight. It's kind of an overview. It's the last one. So this kind of ended with America training the Chinese to fight back. They don't go into any of the major negative on China. They want to try to keep a positive outlook. That's the reason they haven't changed. They didn't go into a whole lot of the other stuff about the puppet states. But we will be back on. We'll be back tomorrow with Recon Surge. I'll be back on Thursday. But until then, stay strong, stay true, stay Frankie. Have a good one.